I've never been the type of person who gets easily spooked by ghost stories, but what happened to me last year made me question everything I believed. I decided to write to you because I need to get this off my chest and maybe find out if anyone else has gone through something similar. I used to think it was all just rumors spread by superstitious folks, but now I admit there are things we simply can't explain. My name is Evan, I'm 48 years old, and I've been working as a cemetery caretaker for over 2 decades. I live in a small town in rural Minnesota, and I've always enjoyed the calm and quiet around here. I'm not easily scared. After all, I've spent most of my life dealing with funerals and the constant presence of death. But what I experienced a few months ago still keeps me up at night. Now that it's all fresh in my memory, I think it might be a good idea to share this story with your audience. It all happened at Pineville Municipal Cemetery, where I work every weeknight, doing rounds to make sure everything is in order. My shift has always been the night shift because, unlike most people, I actually appreciated the silence and peace at that time. If it weren't for my nightly routine, I might never have noticed anything so strange. At first, it was just another ordinary week. Quiet funerals, no unusual activity. But one detail started to grab my attention. Every day before leaving, I do a quick check in certain areas. During one of those checks, I noticed that the soil on one particular grave looked different from the day before, as if someone had been tampering with it. My first thought was that it might be the rain, but there hadn't been any rain that week. Even so, the earth was clearly disturbed, a bit softer, and showed subtle marks as if human hands had been digging. The following day, I showed up earlier to see if the situation continued. To my surprise, the soil looked stirred up again, and it seemed like someone had dug an even deeper hole. Worried about possible vandalism, I reported it to the cemetery management. They suggested placing heavy stones around the grave to make access more difficult, and if necessary, putting up a small barrier. I spent a good part of my shift gathering large rocks and arranging them around the plot. I have to admit I wasn't scared at that point, just curious and annoyed at the idea that some prankster was desecrating a final resting place. I tried to convince myself there was nothing supernatural about it. Kids sometimes pull cruel pranks. Still, whoever was doing this was persistent, and it made me uneasy. I figured it was only a matter of time before I caught them in the act and put an end to it. Frustratingly, reinforcing the grave did little good. The next morning I saw the same thing. Stones had been moved around and replaced haphazardly. It made no sense because some of those rocks were quite heavy and took a lot of effort to lift. I started suspecting someone with free access to the cemetery might be involved, maybe a co-worker or a regular visitor. I talked to my colleague Gerald, who sometimes does the rounds with me, and he mentioned that he also noticed the stones out of place one morning but didn't think much of it. Meanwhile, my curiosity was turning into a constant source of anxiety. I needed to find out what was really happening, even if only to prove it was human activity. So I decided to hide out overnight near the grave, hoping to catch whoever was responsible. I wasn't thrilled with the idea of spending a sleepless night in a graveyard, but I couldn't keep ignoring the problem. I thought, better one bad night's sleep than living with this doubt. The next night I arrived at the cemetery a few minutes early and positioned myself near a row of tall headstones, where a mausoleum provided some cover. I crouched behind it, heart pounding, feeling an unease I'd never experienced in all my years on the job. The silence was almost absolute, except for a gentle breeze rustling the trees and an occasional distant sound from the road. Every minute that passed, I tried to reassure myself it was just a trespasser. At the same time, a voice in the back of my head insisted there was more to this story. I held a small flashlight, but kept it off so I wouldn't draw attention. Even then, my heart jumped at every noise I heard. Around 1:30 in the morning, my phone started showing a low battery alert. I thought about giving up and trying again another night, but I was determined to see this through. It was close to 2 a.m. when I heard faint footsteps, accompanied by the sound of dirt being disturbed. I crept toward the noise, pointing my flashlight at the ground. My stomach churned, and I braced myself to switch on the light and yell at whoever was messing with the grave. But as I rounded a headstone, I saw someone kneeling in the dirt, seemingly digging with their hands. I flicked on the flashlight instinctively, and the shock nearly made me drop it. It was a small child, pale, maybe 9 or 10 years old, with sunken eyes and clothes smeared with soil. The sheer strangeness of it left me speechless. The child didn't look surprised by my presence. They just kept digging as if I wasn't even there. I tried to say something, to ask if they were lost, but my voice came out weak, and the child slowly turned their head toward me. That's when I noticed something even more unsettling. They didn't blink the way a normal child would, and their expression was eerily blank. A chill ran down my spine as I wondered what a child could be doing there alone in the middle of the night. I moved closer, keeping the flashlight low. I asked again if they were okay, if they needed help. Nothing. The child just raised their dirt-covered hands, as if trying to show me something. By then, my heart was pounding so hard it felt like it would leap out of my chest. Every instinct told me to turn around and run, but I forced myself to stay calm. I thought about calling the police, but I was afraid that if I took my eyes off the child, they would vanish. That's when I heard a twig snap behind me. My whole body tensed. I swung the flashlight around, but there was no one there. When I turned back, the child had stood up and stepped back. I couldn't hold back a muffled gasp, and I considered moving closer, but I was frozen by a primal fear. As I tried to grasp what was going on, the child simply turned and ran off into the darkness, weaving between the headstones. The next day, still shaken, I told Gerald what I had seen. He noticed how rattled I was and jokingly asked if I had seen a ghost. He even apologized for not helping me keep watch. He figured I could handle it alone. We spoke with the management and checked the cemetery's records, but there hadn't been any recent burials for a child, nor anything else to suggest a child should be hanging around. The administration even called the local police, who came by the next day, but they found no signs of vandalism or any children on the premises. Despite everything, I kept investigating on my own, asking around to see if any family regularly visited the cemetery or if anyone had heard about a child being there. Nobody knew of any child who frequented the place. The following weeks were torture. I couldn't sleep properly, constantly worrying about what I might see the next night. Eventually, I asked to switch to a day shift, but there were no openings. I tried sticking it out, but the memory of that pale child haunted me every minute of my shift. In the end, I quit my job, despite having more than 20 years of service. I'm not proud of giving up a job that was such a big part of my life, but I couldn't set foot in that cemetery anymore without remembering that fear. To this day, I can't explain what I saw, whether it was just a lost child, someone playing a prank on me, or something truly supernatural. The only thing I'm certain of is that this experience taught me there are things out there that defy any simple explanation. Good evening, Dom. I'm not usually superstitious, but what I witnessed really shook me in a way that's hard to explain. My name is Richard, and this entire story took place in a small town in rural Louisiana. Even though I never intended to attract attention, I feel that sharing this might give me some peace of mind. I know some people will doubt me, but that's inevitable. My hope is that someone who's gone through something similar might feel less alone upon hearing my account. It all began when I started working at the local cemetery about a year ago. I'd been unemployed for months, and a friend mentioned the previous caretaker had just retired. At first, I hesitated because I'm not comfortable dealing with death and all the darker aspects of life. But you know, the electric bill doesn't care about your fears, so I took the job. The cemetery routine was less grim than I'd imagined, although once in a while I felt uneasy if I stayed late or had to open old graves to check for any water damage. The administrator, Mr. Oswald, was a serious man of few words, but always very organized with his records. He kept everything in this old ledger, dates, names, and every little detail. Things went on routinely until about 2 months ago, when I was asked to prepare a grave for a funeral scheduled 2 days later in the oldest section of the cemetery. I found it odd because we almost never had to do anything in that part of the grounds. Those older plots were rarely revisited. Still, I followed orders. As I began digging, I noticed the soil was looser than normal, as if someone had already dug there recently. I figured it might be because of the heavy rains that had soaked the ground in recent days. While digging, my shovel hit something made of wood, partially rotted. My first instinct was to stop and check the ledger. There was no record of any coffin in that spot. I called Mr. Oswald to confirm if we were in the right place. He came over, furrowed his brow at the paperwork, but didn't seem too surprised. He just said, "Close it up and let's keep working where we were told to. Leave it as it is." That made me uneasy. He was always so methodical. Why ignore an unregistered coffin? So, when he walked away, I decided to climb down into the grave to see what was going on. I carefully descended using a makeshift ladder and lit the area with my phone's flashlight. The smell wasn't as strong as I would have expected from an old burial, which already seemed strange. I forced open the rotted lid to see what was inside. I figured I'd find bones at most. But when I finally got it open, I almost dropped my phone in shock. There was a body in an advanced state of decomposition, but not as far along as you'd expect for something buried decades ago. The skin, though pale and partially deteriorated, still covered much of the face, and the dark suit he was wearing was in better shape than it should have been for something supposedly very old. It wasn't exactly intact, but it certainly looked more recent than I expected. A terrible feeling washed over me. I hurried back up and called Mr. Oswald again, breathless. He told me to let it go and not to interfere with the scheduled funeral. I asked if we shouldn't call the police, and he said he'd handle it with the people in charge of the cemetery, but gave me no clear explanation. He seemed more annoyed than scared, which only fueled my suspicions. The whole thing kept bothering me, an unregistered coffin with a body that hadn't decomposed the way it should have. I decided to call the police on my own. While dialing, I remember feeling a chill run down my spine, as if someone were watching me from afar. I spent a few minutes trying to explain the situation to the dispatcher, who sounded skeptical. In the end, they said they'd send someone the next day to check it out, but they didn't seem too concerned. The next morning, 2 patrol cars showed up and they asked me to take them to the grave. I was starting to second-guess myself, wondering if I'd overreacted. But as soon as the officers saw the body, one of them went pale and pulled the other aside to talk privately. They took photos, jotted down notes, and said they'd need to transport the body for an autopsy. That's when Mr. Oswald returned, demanding to know why I'd called the police, and got into an argument with the officers. He denied any knowledge of the situation and complained that it would disrupt the cemetery's routine. Still, the police wouldn't back down. In the days that followed, word got around town. A few local news stations briefly mentioned an unidentified coffin being discovered, but the story soon disappeared from the media. Maybe political pressure got involved, or maybe it just didn't hold people's interest, but it never gained much traction. Then came the strange phone calls. Once or twice a week, my phone would ring, and when I picked up, there was only silence on the other end. Could be a prank, but the timing was too coincidental. My nerves really started to fray when I found weird scribbles on my front gate. It might have been random graffiti, but it made me think twice. What made me even more uneasy was a rumor I heard at the local grocery store. They said the body had disappeared from the morgue, but nobody would confirm anything officially. I asked some contacts in the local police, and they couldn't say for sure. They only mentioned that the autopsy was inconclusive, and that these processes can take time. Honestly, I have no idea if the body really vanished or if it was just rumor. But either way, the uncertainty was enough to keep me on edge, especially since I was the one who found it in the first place. It could be paranoia, but it seemed like the whole town looked at me sideways for speaking up. Mr. Oswald also vanished suddenly, leaving his position without explanation. Some said he went to care for relatives out of state. Others claimed he was pressured to leave because of the investigation. As for me, I quit that job for good and managed to find a side gig in Baton Rouge. I rented a small room and left town. I admit I still dream about that half-preserved face, those old clothes, and that rotting coffin lid. I can't say there was anything truly supernatural about that grave, but I also can't explain what happened, and maybe I never will. If there's one takeaway, it's that we're not always prepared to dig around where we're not supposed to, and sometimes the people keeping secrets can be scarier than any horror story we hear. Before we get to the last story, if you're still here, let me know what time you're watching in the comments. I love seeing who sticks around until the end. Let's not stop now. On to the next. This happened about a month ago, and I still wake up at night in a cold sweat, feeling like something or someone is watching my every move. I've worked as a caretaker in a small cemetery in rural Pennsylvania for almost 10 years now. During that time, I've witnessed plenty of strange things, but nothing that left me so disturbed I started questioning whether I truly understand what goes on here. I decided to share this story because I don't have the courage to talk about it in person with anyone, and maybe getting it off my chest will help reduce my nightmares. I'm not looking for online fame or trying to convince anyone to believe me. I just need to unburden my mind. I promise I'll tell everything exactly the way it happened. No embellishments or exaggerations. All I ask is that if you read to the end, you try to be understanding, because I'm still not sure how to process everything I experienced. My name is Ishmael, and I live alone in a small caretaker's apartment behind the cemetery. I chose to stay here mostly out of convenience for the job, and also because I've always been drawn to the stillness of late night hours. My boss assigns me to do nightly rounds, not only to make sure no one sneaks in, but also to keep an eye on the older headstones. At first, I'll admit I felt uneasy walking among the graves in the pitch-black darkness, but over time I got used to the sounds, the shadows, and even the cats that wander around. Building up the courage to walk through the dark cemetery became routine, and I actually enjoy keeping order, checking for any damaged tombstones or signs of vandalism. Besides, for as creepy as it may sound to some, the quiet nights give me a certain peace, almost like a time to reflect on life. But about a month ago, that peace was utterly shattered, and I still can't get back to my old routine. It all began with faint shapes I swore I could see near the oldest part of the cemetery, but I always chalked it up to my imagination or some odd reflection of light. The first time I noticed one of these figures was around 2 in the morning, when I was doing my rounds, flashlight in hand, double-checking that all the gates were locked. As I passed by the old section, I felt a shiver run up my spine, like someone was standing right behind me staring. I spun around quickly and shone my flashlight, but saw nothing, just the old, sometimes half-crumbled tombs and the usual silence. The next day, I casually mentioned it to Cecil, a guy who does the morning cleaning, but he just laughed, saying I was either tired or getting spooked by stray cats. Even so, I paid more attention in the following nights, and to my surprise, I kept seeing the same crouched figure in the same place, as if it was digging at the ground. The thing vanished as fast as it appeared. Whenever I aimed my flashlight at it, it melted away, like smoke in the air. At one point, I thought it might be a homeless person, or maybe a grave robber trying to unearth something valuable, but I couldn't fathom how anyone could move that fast. That's when I started keeping track of the times I saw it, trying to identify a pattern so I could catch it in the act. But the more days went by, the more anxious I became, and I realized I was growing obsessed with this apparition. I'd even neglect parts of my usual route just to stand at a distance from the old section, hoping the figure would appear, weird as that sounds. And sure enough, it kept showing up, always crouched down, seeming to scratch the soil. Yet every time I approached with my flashlight, there was nothing left. No footprints, no sign of disturbed earth. This really messed with my head because it made no sense. How could anyone disappear so quickly and leave no traces? I tried convincing myself it was paranoia or exhaustion, but each night the feeling of being watched got stronger. I didn't tell anyone else because I could already imagine the jokes. And honestly, what can you say about a shadow that vanishes into thin air? I'd have laughed at it myself not too long ago. Still, I needed to understand once and for all what was happening there, if only to prove I wasn't losing my mind. So, on a cold night, I decided to sneak up quietly, leaving my flashlight on its lowest setting, hoping to catch whatever it was by surprise. I also carried a small wooden baton in case it really was an intruder. I waited until almost 3 in the morning, with the freezing wind making my hands tremble, and I moved quietly toward the old section, stepping carefully to avoid making noise. With each step, my heart pounded harder, and I kept repeating in my mind that I had to stay calm. When I finally got close to those decrepit headstones, I saw it again. The same silhouette crouched down, as if it were clawing at the dirt with its bare hands. This time I stayed still and didn't immediately point the light. I wanted to see more of it, to gauge its shape and size. It looked human, but painfully thin, almost skeletal, and at least 6.5 feet tall, maybe more. The skin was so pale it almost reflected the dim moonlight peeking through the clouds. I had the overwhelming sense that it wasn't breathing at all, not a sound except for the scraping of its nails in the soil. Part of me wanted to run, but another part, driven by morbid curiosity, kept me from backing away. When I mustered the courage to slowly lift my flashlight, being careful not to shine it directly at first, I noticed something even more terrifying. Its eyes were entirely black, like two dark pits sunk into a gaunt face. It was like staring down a wild animal in the darkness, yet there was still something disturbingly human about it, or at least something pretending to be human. My stomach churned with fear, and right then it must have sensed my presence. In one violent motion it whipped its head toward me and made a low, snarling sound that I never imagined a human throat could produce. I stepped backward, stumbling over a small headstone, and my flashlight momentarily lit up its face. That brief glimpse was enough to see those deep hollows under its eyes, skin stretched tight, and something that made me want to vomit, its nails long and grimy, coated in dirt. As soon as the light hit it, the thing vanished just as abruptly as before. But this time, it wasn't like it ran away. It seemed to disintegrate into the air, as strange as that may sound, leaving behind only a few clumps of loose soil on the ground and a chilling emptiness that made me feel utterly alone. I stood there shaking, unsure where to look or what to do. My mind kept insisting none of that was real, but the sweat dripping down my face and the tightness in my chest told me I was very much awake. Still trembling, I checked around for anyone else, looked behind headstones, and even made sure the main gates were locked. Nothing. No sign of any living soul, just the unnerving silence. I headed back to my little apartment, trying to piece together my thoughts, but I barely slept that night. I couldn't stop picturing that horrifying face staring back at me, or that sickening sound of fingernails scraping the ground. The next morning I got up earlier than usual and went straight to the grave where I'd seen the creature. I expected obvious signs that somebody had been digging, the kind of evidence that would confirm what I saw. But to my shock, the earth looked untouched, no holes or disturbed soil. I stood there for a few minutes, questioning if my mind had conjured the whole thing. Then I checked the name on the headstone and nearly jumped out of my skin. It was the name of a well-known man in our town, someone I was positive was still alive. I'd literally just seen him chatting with Cecil at a bar near Main Street 2 days ago. My heart pounded as I tried to make sense of it. Why was this creature digging at a grave with a name that shouldn't even be on a tombstone yet? It was a horrific realization that something very wrong was going on, and that's where my real nightmare began. All day I was restless, trying to figure out how that man's name was on this tombstone. I restrained myself from running off to confront him in town and demanding explanations. I had no clue how to bring this up without sounding crazy. By late afternoon, I managed to ask Cecil almost casually, "Hey, did you know Mr. Harrington already has a headstone here?" He looked at me with surprise and said no, mentioning that the old man was still fit, always riding his bike around the neighborhood. I kept quiet, unsure if I should reveal what I'd seen, but my mind kept cycling through one question. If Mr. Harrington is alive, who on earth is buried in that plot? And why is his exact name etched on the stone? It all felt like a massive administrative screw-up or a sick joke, but after what I witnessed the night before, I couldn't convince myself it was just a paperwork mistake. I went to the tiny office where we store the cemetery records and looked up Mr. Harrington's name. I found an old file, more than 20 years old, indicating that some relative of his was buried there, but there was nothing suggesting they shared the same name. None of it made any sense. I tried checking if the date of death belonged to some younger family member, but everything was jumbled, as though it had all been recorded incorrectly. I felt trapped in a bureaucratic maze, haunted by the memory of that pale face and those black eyes. I couldn't concentrate, always glancing over my shoulder in case that figure appeared again. And the worst part was knowing that if I felt this paranoid in broad daylight, how would I handle facing another night in that cemetery? Yet, like in horror movies, curiosity and fear often travel together. That same night, I did my rounds with even more caution. My flashlight seemed feeble against the darkness, engulfing every pathway between the graves. I tried avoiding the old section entirely, but at the same time I couldn't resist the urge to check that nothing worse was going on there. As I neared Mr. Harrington's tomb, I felt my heart race again. the air around me seeming dense and heavy. I called out, "Is anyone there?" but heard nothing but the echo of my own voice. No figure, no creature, just the silhouettes of the trees swaying in the wind. Still, I could sense that even if it was invisible, something was watching me. For a moment it crossed my mind that this entity might be tied to Mr. Harrington's health, a bad omen of sorts. But none of that felt rational. Then again, nothing about this is rational, and that's what haunts me the most. I never got around to speaking directly to Mr. Harrington. I avoided meeting him in town because I didn't want to seem insane, blurting out some story about a phantom digging up his grave. All I did was quietly ask around if anyone had heard rumors about his health failing or any talk of him passing away. But everyone said he was going strong. Even so, every night I hear those scraping sounds in my memory, as if something is beckoning me back there. I don't know what that creature wants, or why it was so determined to open a grave that apparently isn't even occupied. I keep doing my rounds, but now there's a constant dread, my eyes darting everywhere, expecting it to appear at any moment. Worst of all, I still have no answers, and I feel more alone in this ordeal every day. Maybe someday I'll find the courage to talk to Mr. Harrington or confide in someone who might take me seriously. Until then, the best I can do is share what I saw and hope I never encounter that ghastly being again. Frankly, I'm not sure I'd walk away unharmed if I did. Before we get to the last story, if you're still here, let me know what time you're watching in the comments. I love seeing who sticks around until the end. Let's not stop now. On to the next.